Welcome to Democracy in Action, insights and discussion about some of the most talked about topics of the previous month with the Fulcrum's collaborators. Consistent with the Fulcrum's mission, the program strives to share many perspectives to widen our readers' viewpoints. I'm Hugo Balta, Executive Editor of the Fulcrum and your host. Joining us are Doris Maldonado Mendez, a member of the Connecticut Mirror's Community Editorial Board. Dr. Ulcca Joshi Hansen, a futurist and author of the award-winning book, The Future of Smart. And Seth David Radwell, author of American Schism. Welcome all to the program. So let's start with the conversation with Linda McMahon. The former professional wrestling magnate was confirmed as Secretary of Education by a 51 to 45 vote along party lines. This is not her first rodeo with Trump, having led the U.S. Small Business Administration during her first term. McMahon has limited background in education. She served on Connecticut's State Board of Education for about a year. Seth, in your column, you cited numerous sources that President Trump may soon sign an executive order directing the Secretary of Education to dismantle the Federal Department of Education. What are your thoughts on McMahon? And tell us more about your column.
So recently, as you mentioned, she has been confirmed as the new Secretary of Education, and she has a little bit of experience in education, but not much. So one could have a whole discussion about whether or not she's qualified for this role. But the larger underlying current here, Hugo, is that there's been a plan that goes back to the Project 2025 report on shutting down the department, which I think, given our performance in education as a nation, given both our scores and our lack of competitiveness in the global market, if you will, for skills, I think this is a horrible direction to take, which is what I wrote about in the column.
Seth, I want to add here. I mean, I think the Federal Department of Education, so much of their dollars or so much of their time is spent administering grants and loan programs. So that's a big part of it. A large part of the dollars are then sent for Title I and special needs. And so a lot of the communities that are going to be most hurt are students and families who get that support. And many people don't know that they're getting it from the federal government. The one thing I will say, though, is that I think we've seen over the last 30 years that the federal government through Obama and others have tried to increase performance at the state level. But I think they've done that, just given my own theories and ideas about education. They've focused on things like test scores and focused on things that I think, given where AI is, given where technology is, really make the outdatedness of our existing system manifest. And so I'm very curious about what can happen if we push more conversations down to the local and state level, where young people are more connected into the communities and ecosystems where they're likely to get jobs and more able to kind of hopefully have an education that is not about memorizing and scoring well on tests and content, but rather about lived experiences and that help to develop competencies. So yeah. I'd be curious what you think about that, though.
Sure. Well, I think no one can make the argument that our investment in education has paid off. We've spent a lot of money and we have not succeeded at improving education. And I think no one would argue either the whole notion of the fundamental locus of control of education is in fact the states. But here's what's missing, and you don't hear this at all. We have in the conversation. We have a tremendous opportunity as a federation of 50 states with thousands of experiments going on at the local level in education, where the role of the DOE itself, the Department of Education, needs to be rethought entirely. The whole objective should be focused on, besides objective setting and target setting, which is important, I would argue, is allowing the states funding experiments at the state and local level. So yes, pushing more money down at the local level, but the whole goal then is to help promulgate best practices and help share what's working and what's not working. The whole concept is to create a database that's based on real numbers regarding what educational programs that are innovative and are locally running are working and how to spread them in other parts of the country. And that's the powerful role that we as an experiment of 50 states can have. And that is not so in other words, the Department of Education needs to be reoriented, needs to be rebuilt. But I'm not arguing that it's been successful. But I think that's what is not in the conversation today. You know, one of the great examples that I mentioned in my column is if you look historically over the course of our history, we've had some great leaders reorient major departments. One of the and George Marshall, who served after World War II, is reorienting the military, did an incredible job. But I guess what worries me today is that it seems like what Trump administration speaks about is things that get what I would call political red meat. Things like DEI, things like teaching critical race theory. I mean, they're using basically a set of politically charged terms to argue for taking the department apart. And as institutionalists, I think that's very dangerous. What we should be doing is reorienting and rebuilding it so that we effectively push more money to the states, but that we learn from best practices.
I couldn't agree with you more. If I can interject with my own lived experiences as a person with disabilities, mom of children with medical complexities, and also a certified teacher. For that very reason, it was paramount that I become a certified teacher because my children and the children that I've represented as a guardian ad litem were not successful at inclusively accessing their free appropriate education, and as guaranteed by federal law, and definitely not under the IDEA. So with my little context, after birth to 3 for my twins, and over 20 providers, and my twins' first kindergarten planning and placement team meeting, I was literally identified by the town psychiatrist who had never seen me before or my family during his 5-minute assessment of my children as a single mom from an urban setting, which had no context or relevance in that conversation, really, with children that came from foster care systems with failure to thrive and reactive attachment disorder. That was a default excuse that I see often. Nothing could have been further from the truth. As for the dismantling of the DOE, the executive branch can't do that unilaterally and functionally. We're all aware of that. And that is in federal statute since 1979's with President Jimmy Carter's administration. But what the education, although the education is largely at a state and local level, the DOE is tasked to include that, which includes grants to high need communities. Title I ensures funding to schools with high concentrations of low income students. It administers student aid for those going to college, collects national and statewide data for research, and it oversees protections for diverse disability students with disabilities under the IDEA. Both of the most recent secretaries of education have come from the Constitution state of Connecticut, where I'm from right now, residing in, and are vastly reflective of our own socioeconomic divide between the urban districts and the wealthiest suburbanized. Our small state was the richest state from 1987 to 2021, and yet we have the largest communities living well beyond the poverty levels, and rural areas with not so much as a clinic or reliable transportation. So reinventing the wheel and obliterating an entire federal agency is not in the best interest. They don't have a plan, really, and it's going to be detrimental to our future.
Well, I mean, I will say, I think when they talk about educational freedoms too, right, we know that discourse is very much intended to say, let's take money out of the public system, give it back to families to make choices, which essentially leads to privatization over time of the education system. And there's a philosophical question, I think, right, whether we still believe that a public education system in a nation like ours especially is foundational for democracy. So
absolutely, that's
I think they have an agenda.
That is the fundamental question: is do we believe I mean, one of the founding principles, I think, of our country is the notion of a meritocracy, that if you work hard, you can succeed. But that requires having access to an education. And so that really, you're exactly right. That is one of the underlying issues here. But that's not even discussed. You see, the issue, what's in the news and what's talked about, even in Project 2025, I read the entire chapter, it doesn't have the philosophical conversation, which is why I think, Ugo, going back to the column, I laid out, what fundamentally should the mission of DOE be? And I think there are four things I would put out there. I think number one is about realistic target setting, ambitious but realistic target setting. The second one is funding and supporting the local programs that are innovative and that work and that help supercharge the ones that are successful and promulgate them to other states. That's the second one. And I think the third one is fundamentally we do have to address the access issue because there's a crisis in access of it to education. So I think that is an important objective. But in any case, you can't really have this conversation in a substantive way unless you talk about what the objectives of what's the mission of the Department of Education in the first place in a system where local control is fundamental. What is the model there? And that's what's not discussed.
Dr. Hansen, I want to continue the conversation with you. Among the many stories of chaos created by DOGE, the Department of Government Efficiency, is the story of a plant in Georgia that makes a special peanut butter paste for severely malnutritioned children around the world. It had been abruptly canceled and almost as quickly reinstated. Dr. Hansen, you have served as a consultant working with international schools serving American students abroad, and your family served U.S. aid for 2 decades. Please share your thoughts on the disruptive changes caused by the executive order and some insights you shared in your column.
Thank you. Yes, I think it's almost impossible for us to truly understand the reverberations of the decision to recall and shutter programs. USAID plays such an important role in terms of overall health, educational, diplomatic, kind of global safety considerations. It's one of those soft diplomacy projects and programs that has underlied American participation in the global world and has given us a lot of soft power in ways that don't make it right into our homes and living rooms. So I found out, I was at a conference when international schools learned that there was the possibility that folks that were in their community were going to be uniformly recalled. So this was a Tuesday, and the first hints were that they were going to be recalled on Friday, which of course sent people into chaos. And one of the things I talked about in the article was that we weren't talking about the incredible disruption this would have just on families and individual students who were going to be pulled out. Let's say you're a senior in your final semester, college applications are in, you're in the middle of an AP course or finishing your IB diploma, to be recalled back to the US to have your visa expire and be unlawfully in the country was going to kind of disrupt kind of their education and their lives on so many levels. And it's, that was a American, something that was relevant maybe to more Americans because these are American children, American citizens whose lives are being disrupted. But we've already started to see the stories of medical clinics being shuttered, medications not being put out, food not being delivered. It is almost certain that we're going to have famine and sort of crises related to medications and hunger. And in a world that is interconnected. I was listening to the president's address to Congress and the whole framing of the narrative as though all this stuff is happening in these countries and places that nobody knows about or cares about. We will soon have to care about them. And our memory of COVID is really short, right? That a virus that began in a small province in China disrupted our lives and the lives of people around the world. But so I think we're not sure what's happening with USAID. There are, as you can imagine, a lot of lawsuits, both from workers as well as contractors. So the Supreme Court made a significant ruling yesterday regarding his attempt to freeze foreign aid funding, where essentially the department was told, or the program was told, not to pay contractors for work that was already done. It was a split decision. Interestingly, Judge Roberts and Amy Comer Barrett joined the liberals in sort of assessing that they needed to go back down to the district court and see whether the district decision would be upheld and justified. But I think this raises a bigger question. Seth, you used the term institutionalist. And I think, one of the questions, and I'd love to talk about this later, is if you think about this in the fourth turning kind of metaphor, this idea that progress occurs in cycles, it isn't linear, and that generally speaking, there are these four stages and cycles. The first turning where you have institutions that are functioning and working, the second where they're beginning to devolve, the third where you go into a crisis mode, and the fourth where you begin to rebuild. To the extent that we are in that sort of moment between the third and fourth crisis, I think a lot of what we're seeing, if we pull out of the programs and consider that there's this question of rule of law and whether the US is a country of rule of law, and then this bigger question of does our Constitution and our constitutional democracy stand? I think a lot of what we could also talk about is where we are in this cycle of destruction. And this administration, whether knowingly or not, is cruelly destroying institutions very quickly. That's going to have a lot of short-term impacts. And maybe this was something that needed to happen in order for new institutions to build themselves. And I'm not advocating for that. I just think it's something that I've been talking about and considering a lot with colleagues and others.
I guess one of the questions I would ask, look, and I think your point's right on, so I'm very cognizant of what you're referencing. Is it about tearing apart institutions, or is it about rebuilding them in a way that can be more effective in the 21st century? I think that's the fundamental question. And when I hear the conversation from this administration, it seems like it's very focused on tearing apart with very little discussion of what the new mission should be.
Yeah, I don't disagree with you. And I will say, and Hugo has heard this, but I kind of have a larger frame. I'm a futurist first and foremost, so I think about these kinds of trends. But I think there are ways of operating in our existing system that lean into the human tendency to kind of have our thinking and even our imagination of what's possible ossified over time, where there are just certain mental patterns and ways of operating. And so we have seen, right, despite amazing efforts in lots of different departments and agencies at the local and federal level, that institutions haven't quite been able to change, because at a certain point, systems are designed to recreate and propagate themselves, not to change. And so it's at a certain point, it's about building systems that have a different DNA,
Yes.
for lack of a better word. And again, when we look historically, that has sometimes been what has had to happen.
Yeah.
And we find ourselves here again. And I think it's a tendency to want to say that we're so unique that we're not going to be experiencing the same things that history has shown us are sort of patterns.
Well, I think that's right. I would just comment that yes, there is this ossification that happens, which makes change difficult, so that leads to the argument that not even tearing apart, shaking up, let's say, is sometimes required. But institutions also have our institutional memory. They also have learned a lot from lessons that no human being can hold. So that institutional memory is also very important.
Yeah, and I want to be very clear, right? I'm not advocating that this is a good thing. I think the short and long-term pain that is being created by the decisions of this administration, both in the US and abroad, are going to be felt, and they're going to be extreme. And I don't quite understand a level of sort of either cruelness or just willful disregard of that in some of the conversations that are happening in the halls of power. Right, I'm trying to kind of do both, sit in the current moment and think about, because to your point, Seth, I think those of us who are institutionalists, many of whom are, let's say, over the age of 40 or 50, it is not going to be us that rebuilds these new institutions. It's going to be people who are in their teens and 20s who frankly don't believe in institutions.
That's right.
They have never lived in a world where they have experienced functional institutions that allow people to move forward. I have members of my family who, voted for President Trump, including this second time. And one of the things they say is, we came to this country, we worked hard, we didn't break the law, other people have to do that. And what I have to say to them is, if you came today, those same institutions and opportunities wouldn't exist for you because they've been undone over the last 25 to 30 years.
I think that very few people would disagree that we can make government more efficient. that reform is necessary. I think a lot of the criticism, and I think rightfully so, is just how things are being executed. I think for all of the credit that people give Donald Trump for his background in business, and the same thing with Elon Musk, what they're executing, I've seen a lot in corporate America, and it just takes away the humanity of what change should look like. Now, I'd like to turn it over to Doris. We've mentioned a couple of times change, diversity, equity, and inclusion, reform. Upon returning to the White House, Trump ordered the shutdown of all federal DEI initiatives, and at his urging, many in the private sector have followed suit. Walmart, McDonald's, Meta, and Amazon are among the growing list of companies ditching or scaling back their diversity policies. Doris, you wrote DEI programs are essential to tackle systemic barriers. You've already shared some real life examples about that. In your column, you shared that growing up, your cultural identity was nurtured by family, but when you step beyond the safeguards of home, the experiences as an undergrad and grad student were revealing. Tell us about that and the continued attack on diversity, equity, and inclusion initiatives.
Thank you, Hugo, and to my esteemed panel. It's been quite a whirlwind for the past couple of weeks, and I'm a proud New Yorican born with disabilities and with the honor of being a national Latina disability leader, community health worker, promotora, and former appointee, and the first Latina chair of the Council on Connecticut Developmental Disabilities, first Latina president of NAMI Connecticut, National Alliance of Mental Illness, and the first Latina chair of the Keep the Promise Coalition. Many firsts in a lot of organizations that are being impacted right now. But more importantly, I'm a fierce mom. My parents, to give some context, arrived from Puerto Rico as teens to New York during the Great Migration, and exodus of about 25% of the island's population, and secondary to what was coined the Puerto Rican problem and the locust plague. My journey was marked by the absence of Latina representation in required texts and academic spaces. So I found my sense of community in community-based, cultural, and faith-based organizations that allowed me to revel in the aspects of being a first-generation Latina in Spanglish, shared traditions, and we were all in the quest of the impossible dream of shattering the glass ceiling. So many of us as students, researchers, and staff from marginalized backgrounds have historically faced exclusions, racism, and isolation within institutions because they were designed to serve in the interests of the privileged. Most recently, in honor of steering the Yale University's investment in inclusion and access in various forms, like the Latino Recovery Colectivo, whose mission is to uplift Latina researchers and community voices, ensure equitable access to resources, and advocate for systemic change. And currently, I'm working on the Bold Beauty Project at Yale. It's a powerful visual arts exhibition that celebrates diverse women with disabilities nationally and internationally. So when those resources are increasingly allocated to programs that focus on the narrow vision of meritocracy and color blindness, basically, we need to revisit the populations that have been benefited from the indivisible liberty and justice for all programs, because I'm not calling them DEI. They were embedded in our Constitution and in our pledges far before that. We've had veterans. DEIA programs have intentionally included veteran hiring initiatives and have facilitated transitions into civilian workforce. We have women. Women have benefited from equal pay initiative, promotions, and leadership opportunities, breaking barriers in historically male-dominated industries. But DEIA has not been inclusive of people of color. Caucasian women have benefited from the have been the largest, among the largest beneficiaries of affirmative action and DEIA programs by gaining increased access to education and career advancement. Our rural communities, I live in a rural community right now, and economically disadvantaged communities have benefited from these programs, those driven policies that have created opportunities for those with from low-income families, regardless of race. And the LGBTQ plus community have been protected in workplaces with equitable hiring practices and that have improved and provided safer and more inclusive environments for our professionals. So this attack is compromising our progress. And if institutional policies shift away from prioritizing equity, then what is it about? It should be about ensuring that those barriers do not exist in the first place. Cultural organizations are not anomalies. We're essential. Shutting us down undermines the rich community-driven experiences preserved in our inherited histories.
Doris, I so appreciate all of the kind of groups, right, that you drew this picture of the richness of a community when you actually think about the diversity of it. And I think the picture that you're drawing requires an underlying belief system of abundance, that there is enough, that it's not sort of this issue of it's between you and me. And I think what we're seeing right now is this kind of battle playing out in real time between a worldview that's sort of either or. We have it or you have it. We get it or you get it. And there isn't enough to go around, versus an assumption that there is enough to go around. And so we can give and there will be more. And I'm just really curious, right, with both of you and how we can each in our communities kind of help get back down to some of those conversations that allow us all to sit in that space of there is enough. And I think that's related to the polarization that we're seeing, that I would say on both the far right and the far left, there has sometimes been a tendency to make it us versus them. We have it or they have it. And we know that in the US, there's this silent majority of people who have more agreement than disagreement and can certainly see the possibility that there is enough for their neighbors and for them. And the question of how we re-engage our communities and our civic engagement and our voters to actually believe in one, to get candidates who can articulate something like that, and then to also vote for them so that we get more moderates back into the spaces where we're having to make these conversations about systems and institutions.
It's that allyship that we really need to dig down deep into and work on now more than ever. The allyship that we've been working on for decades. It's important. It's essential.
Yeah, and I agree. I think that for what I could add to this great conversation is that it's also about changing the narrative. This us versus them is a very capitalist society framework, which means succeeding at all costs and not considering the damage that you do on your way up. And it's also about the negative narrative of how DEI has been positioned as something to be fixed, when in reality, it's a positive. It's an opportunity to be realized. And when we as human beings look at an opportunity, we organically take a step back. We are organically inclusive of others. We invite them to come on this journey, to take a look at this opportunity and help us strategize how to realize that. Doris, Dr. Hansen, Seth, this has been time well spent. Thank you so much for your insights and for your time.
Thank you all.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Visit us at thefulcrum.us and check out their great work. This is Democracy in Action, insights and discussions about some of the most talked about topics of the previous month with Fulcrum collaborators. I'm Hugo Balta. Thank you all for watching.